The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the Winterfang territory, blanketing the ancient pine forests and rocky outcroppings in a suffocating white silence that seemed to muffle even the howls of the pack gathered in the central clearing. Alara stood in the middle of that clearing, her thin frame shaking not just from the bitter cold that bit through her worn cloak, but from the weight of dozens of hostile stares boring into her from every direction. The pack had formed a tight circle around her, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear, anger, and something far worse, a collective relief that they had found someone to blame for the misfortune that had befallen them over the past 3 months. She could smell their emotions on the wind, acrid and overwhelming. And her wolf whimpered somewhere deep inside her chest, a pathetic half-formed creature that had never fully manifested, leaving her forever incomplete in the eyes of those who valued strength above all else. Elder. Morvenna stepped forward, her silver hair whipping around her weathered face, as she raised one gnarled hand to point directly at Alara. The old woman's voice carried across the clearing with practiced authority, each word landing like a physical blow against Alara's already bruised spirit. She spoke of the plague that had struck their livestock, the hunting parties that returned empty-handed week after week, the children who fell ill with fevers that no healer could break, and worst of all, the weakening of the pack bonds themselves, as if some invisible force was slowly unraveling the magical ties that held them together as a cohesive unit. Morvenna's finger trembled as she declared what the Council of Elders had decided in their secret deliberations the night before, that Alara, the cursed Omega who could not even shift properly, who brought shame to her bloodline and weakness to the pack, was the source of their suffering. She was the bad luck incarnate, the rotten apple that would spoil the entire barrel if not removed immediately. Alpha Kale stood at the edge of the circle, his massive frame rigid with tension that Alara could read even from across the clearing. His dark eyes met hers for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief connection, she felt the pull she had always felt around him, that inexplicable magnetism that made her heart race and her incomplete wolf surge toward the surface, desperately trying to reach him. But Kale looked away almost immediately, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. And he said nothing as Elder Morvenna pronounced the sentence, banishment to the frozen wastes during the height of the winter's fury, the legendary storm that struck the mountains every century with such ferocity that even the strongest wolves avoided those peaks when the signs appeared. It was a death sentence dressed in ceremonial language, and everyone in that clearing knew it. Alara would be marched to the boundary, stones before nightfall and driven beyond the pack's protection, left to face the storm alone with nothing but the clothes on her back. The younger wolves in the crowd jeered and threw clumps of frozen mud that struck Alara's shoulders and back, their cruelty emboldened by the Elder's sanction, while the older pack members simply watched with cold satisfaction or carefully maintained neutrality. Alara's only friend, a kind-hearted beta named Iris, stood near the back of the crowd with tears streaming down her face, but she did not speak up. Could not speak up without risking her own position in the pack hierarchy. This was how it had always been in Winterfang. Strength was everything, and weakness was not just discouraged, but actively punished. Alara had spent her entire 22 years as the pack's favorite target for mockery, the Omega who couldn't shift completely, who stumbled over her own feet during training, who flinched at loud noises and preferred reading ancient texts. In the pack library to hunting with the others, she had tried so hard to be useful, to prove her worth through other means, studying healing and history, helping with the youngest pups, maintaining the sacred spaces, but none of that mattered when the pack needed a scapegoat. As the guards came forward to seize her arms and begin the march to the boundary, Alara caught one more glimpse of Kale, and this time she saw something raw and anguished in his expression before he deliberately turned his back and walked away. That hurt worse than all the rest of it combined, because somewhere in the deepest part of her soul, she had always suspected what her wolf had been trying to tell her for years, that Kale was her fated mate, the one the moon goddess had chosen for her before either of them were born. But fate meant nothing in the face of pack politics and social hierarchy, and Kale was the alpha, powerful and respected, while she was nothing. He would never risk his position to save her. Never stand against his own pack for someone as worthless as the girl who couldn't even shift properly. The realization settled over her like a physical weight as the guards dragged her toward the tree line. And something inside her that had been desperately holding on finally began to crack. The journey to the boundary took 3 hours of brutal hiking through increasingly deep snow, with the guards shoving her forward whenever she stumbled and muttering curses about having to waste their time on such a pathetic assignment. The storm was already building on the horizon, dark clouds roiling and churning as they swept down from the highest peaks, and Alara could feel the temperature dropping with each passing minute. By the time they reached the ancient standing stones that marked the edge of Winterfang territory, her feet were numb in her inadequate boots, and her fingers had lost all feeling despite being tucked under her arms. The head guard, a brutal man named Torsten, who had always particularly enjoyed humiliating her during combat training, shoved her past the stones with enough force to send her sprawling face first into a snowdrift. He spat on the ground near her head and told her that the storm would do what her own weakness could not, finally remove her taint from the world. And then the guards turned and headed back toward the safety of Packlands without a single backward glance. Alara lay in the snow for a long moment, her body already beginning to succumb to the cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and seemed to settle directly into her bones. The wind was picking up, howling through the bare branches of the skeletal trees that dotted this high-altitude wasteland, and she could see the wall of white approaching from the north as the full fury of the winter's fury began to unleash itself. She had perhaps an hour before the worst of it hit, maybe less, and with no shelter and no way to generate heat, she would be dead long before morning. Part of her wanted to simply stay there in the snow, to let the cold take her quickly, and be done with all the pain and humiliation and loneliness that had defined her existence. But another part of her, a part she had never fully acknowledged before, burned with sudden fierce anger at the injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong except be born different, and now she would die alone in the wilderness because her pack needed someone to blame for problems that had nothing to do with her. With trembling limbs, Alara forced herself to stand, swaying dangerously as the wind tried to knock her back down. She stumbled forward into the wasteland, having no destination in mind, but driven by some instinct she did not understand to keep moving, to not give up, even though logic told her it was hopeless. The landscape around her was utterly alien, nothing but white snow and dark rocks, and the occasional twisted tree, with the mountains looming in the distance like the teeth of some massive beast. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, her thoughts growing increasingly scattered as hypothermia began to set in, and she found herself thinking about her mother, who had died when Alara was just 5 years old, too young to remember much more than a gentle voice and warm arms. Her mother had been Omega too, but unlike Alara, she had been able to shift fully, had been valued for her nurturing nature and her gift with the young ones. Alara wondered if her mother would be ashamed of what her daughter had become, or if she would have fought harder to protect her from the pack's cruelty. The storm hit with the force of a physical assault, wind screaming so loudly that Alara could not hear her own thoughts, snow driving horizontally with such intensity that she could not see more than a few inches in front of her face. She fell to her knees, then to her side, curling into a ball as the drifts began to build around her with terrifying speed. Her wolf was howling inside her, a sound of pure terror and grief. But there was something else too, something stirring in her blood that she had never felt before. It felt ancient and vast and utterly foreign, as if something that had been sleeping for a very long time was finally beginning to wake up. The cold that had been killing her moments ago suddenly felt different, less like an enemy, and more like something reaching for her with curious fingers, and Alara's eyes flew open in shock as she realized. The snow touching her skin was no longer painful but almost warm. Before you continue with this story, hit that like button. If you're already hooked by Alara's journey from outcast to something far more powerful, because what happens next is going to completely transform everything you thought you knew about her character. The temperature around Alara continued to shift in ways that defied natural law. the biting cold that should have been shutting down her organs and pulling her into the final. Sleep instead, becoming something almost comfortable, almost welcoming, as if the storm itself was wrapping around her like a blanket, rather than trying to kill her. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, gasping as she realized she could see clearly despite the whiteout conditions, could perceive every individual snowflake as it swirled through the air in intricate patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Her incomplete wolf had gone utterly silent, not from fear, but from awe, as if it too recognized that something fundamental was changing in the fabric of Alara's being. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to be carried on the wind itself, speaking in a language that Alara should not have understood but somehow comprehended perfectly in the deepest parts of her consciousness. "Daughter of the Frost," the voice called her. "Last child of the Winterborn, heir to the frozen crown." The words made no sense to her rational mind, but her body responded. Without her conscious will, power surging up from somewhere in her core that she had never known existed, her hands sank into the snow, and instead of feeling wet and cold, the snow began to glow with pale blue light that spread outward from her touch like ripples on a pond. The storm above her seemed to pause, the howling wind dropping to an almost reverent murmur, and Alara looked up to see shapes forming in the swirling snow, translucent figures that looked like women in flowing robes with ice, crystals for hair and eyes that burned with winter's eternal light. The spirits, for that was clearly what they were, circled around her with expressions of wonder and something that looked almost like relief, and the one who seemed to be their leader reached down with a hand that was more suggestion than substance to touch Alara's forehead. The moment that frozen finger made contact, Alara's mind exploded with visions and memories that were not her own, centuries of history pouring into her, consciousness in an overwhelming flood that threatened to drown her entirely. She saw a civilization of powerful women who commanded the elements, who lived in crystal palaces high in the mountains and kept the balance between winter and spring, life and death, cultivation and wilderness. She saw them called the Winter Maidens, respected and feared by all the supernatural creatures who shared these lands, their magic so profound that they could freeze entire armies with a thought or call down, blizzards that lasted for months. She saw them living in harmony with the wolf packs for generations, a mutual respect between those who ran with the wild and those who commanded it, until jealousy and fear began to poison that relationship. The vision shifted to show her the betrayal. Wolf packs led by ambitious alphas who resented sharing territory with beings more powerful than themselves, who spread lies and propaganda about the Winter Maidens being dangerous witches who would eventually enslave or destroy all who opposed them. She saw secret meetings in the dead of night, alliances formed between packs that had been enemies for centuries, all united in their determination to eliminate the threat they perceived the maidens to be. And then came the massacre, coordinated attacks during the spring equinox, when the maidens' power was at its weakest, waves of wolves pouring into the crystal palaces to slaughter everyone they found, regardless of age or ability to fight back. The Winter Maidens fought with everything they had, calling down ice storms and avalanches that buried entire attacking forces. But they were outnumbered and caught by surprise, and one by one their defenses fell. By the time the sun set on that terrible day, the Winter Maiden civilization was destroyed, their palaces shattered, their people dead or scattered to the winds, their very existence slowly fading into legend and myth. But some had escaped, the vision showed her, a handful of survivors who fled into the lowlands and hid their nature, breeding with humans and wolves alike in desperate attempts to survive. The Winter Maiden blood grew thinner with each generation, the magic diluting until it became nothing more than an occasional odd quirk, a child born with unusually pale hair or an inexplicable affinity for cold weather. Most of these descendants never knew what they carried in their veins, the knowledge of their heritage lost along with everything else the wolves had destroyed. Alara watched with tears streaming down her face as she saw her own bloodline traced backward through the centuries. Omega after Omega in various packs, always the weakest and most overlooked, their wolf halves unable to fully manifest because they were trying to contain something that was never meant to be caged by fur and fang. Her mother had carried the blood, and her grandmother before her, all the way back to a winter maiden named Airless, who had survived the massacre by hiding in a wolf pack and pretending to be nothing more than what she appeared. The visions finally released her, and Alara collapsed forward onto her hands, gasping and shaking, not from cold, but from the overwhelming weight of everything she had just learned. She was not a weak Omega. She was the descendant of beings who had once been powerful enough to make even the strongest alphas kneel, and her inability to shift properly was not a defect, but a sign that she was meant for something completely different. The wolf inside her had always struggled because it was not her true nature, merely an echo of her ancestors' attempt to hide among those who had destroyed them. Her real power came from the winter itself, from the ancient magic that flowed through her veins like liquid ice. And now that she knew the truth, now that she had been pushed to the absolute brink of death, that power was finally free to manifest in its full, terrible glory. Alara stood slowly, feeling strength flooding into her limbs that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the elemental forces now responding to her will. The storm around her intensified, but it was not attacking her. It was bowing to her, recognizing her as its rightful mistress. She raised her arms and the wind obeyed, swirling around her in a vortex that lifted her hair and cloak, but did not buffet or harm her. She thought about warmth, and immediately felt heat radiating from her core. Not the heat of fire, but the peculiar warmth that comes from being perfectly adapted to cold, the way a polar bear feels comfortable in temperatures that would kill most creatures. The spirits of the ancient winter maidens gathered closer, their translucent faces showing approval and encouragement, and Alara understood instinctively that they had been waiting for this moment, for a daughter of their bloodline to finally awaken and remember what had been stolen from them all those centuries ago. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see Alara claim the power that is rightfully hers and bring justice to those who destroyed her ancestors, because the transformation we are about to witness is going to be absolutely epic. The spirits began to speak, their voices overlapping in a strange harmony that taught Alara the basics of what she could do, how to reach out with her consciousness and touch the winter that permeated everything around her, how to shape ice and snow with nothing but thought and will, how to call the cold into her body and channel it outward in devastating waves. She practiced tentatively at first, creating small sculptures of ice that rose from the ground at her command. Then with growing confidence as she realized the magic responded to her intent, almost before she fully formed the thought. Within an hour, she could freeze the moisture in the air into deadly projectiles, could cause the temperature to drop so precipitously that frost formed instantly on every surface, could summon winds that would strip flesh from bone if she so desired. But the spirits warned her that power without control was meaningless, that the winter maidens had not just been warriors, but scholars and leaders who understood the responsibility that came with their abilities. They showed her how to sense the natural rhythms of the seasons, how to work with the world rather than against it, how to use her magic to nurture and protect as well as destroy. Alara absorbed every lesson with desperate hunger, aware that she was receiving in hours what should have taken years of training. But the spirits seemed to have infinite patience with her fumbling attempts, gently correcting her mistakes and celebrating her successes. They told her about the frozen palace that still stood hidden in the highest peaks, protected by wards that would recognize her blood and grant her entry, where she would find the accumulated knowledge of her people preserved in ice that never melted and books that never decayed. As the night wore on and Alara's power grew, she began to understand the full implications of what the pack had done when they banished her. The winter maiden magic in her bloodline, even diluted and dormant as it had been maintaining a delicate balance in the Winterfang territory for generations. Her presence, unbeknownst to anyone including herself, had been moderating the weather, ensuring successful hunts by guiding prey into the pack's territory and reinforcing the magical bonds that held the pack. Together, through the subtle influence of her untapped power, reaching out instinctively to protect those she lived among, despite their cruelty toward her. The moment she crossed the boundary stones, that stabilizing influence had been severed, and the territory had immediately begun to suffer the consequences. The plague, the failed hunts, the weakening bonds, all of it was not caused by Alara's presence but by her absence, by the sudden removal of magic that had been quietly supporting the pack, for longer than anyone alive could remember. The realization filled Alara with a complex mixture of vindication and bitter sorrow, because it meant that Winterfang had destroyed itself through its own prejudice and cruelty, condemning to death the very person who had been keeping them safe all along. She wondered if Kyle understood, if somewhere in his alpha instincts he had felt the wrongness of banishing her, but lacked the courage or knowledge to act on that feeling. The thought of him sent a sharp pang through her chest that had nothing to do with the cold, and her newly awakened power responded to her emotional turmoil by causing the temperature to drop another 10 degrees in a quarter-mile radius. The spirits noticed her distress, and one of them, a maiden who introduced herself as Airlise, the very ancestor who had first hidden among the wolves, touched Alara's shoulder with ghostly fingers and advised her that the bond she felt to the Alpha was real, that the moon goddess did indeed recognize them as fated mates, but that such bonds were merely the beginning of a relationship, not a guarantee of happiness or even compatibility. Airlise told her that the old ways of the Winter Maidens had valued choice above destiny, that they believed true love could only exist when both parties consciously chose each other every single day, rather than simply accepting what fate handed them. A mate bond was a gift, Airlise explained. But like all gifts, it could be rejected if the recipient proved themselves unworthy of it. And worthiness was demonstrated through actions, not intentions, through sustained effort, not momentary courage. Kale had failed Alara when she needed him most, had chosen his position and comfort over defending his mate, and while that failure did not make him irredeemable, it did mean he would have to work extraordinarily hard to prove he deserved a second chance. Alara would have to decide for herself whether his future actions warranted her forgiveness, whether the love she felt for him was enough to overcome the betrayal of his silence when she was condemned to death. The thought of returning to Winterfang filled Alara with conflicting emotions. Rage at how they had treated her, warring with a treacherous hope that she might finally be able to make them see her worth. Fear of being hurt again, mixing with a burning desire for justice. The spirits counseled patience, reminding her that she was still new to her power and would need time to fully master it before confronting an entire pack of hostile wolves. They guided her toward the frozen palace, teaching her how to navigate by the stars and the feel of the ancient ley lines that crisscrossed the mountains. And as dawn broke over the peaks, Alara caught her first glimpse of her inheritance. The palace rose from the mountainside as if it had been carved from a single massive glacier, its spires and towers gleaming with crystalline beauty, its walls etched with runes that pulsed with faint blue light. It was breathtaking and terrible in equal measure, a monument to the civilization that had been destroyed, and a promise that their legacy would not be forgotten. Alara spent the next 3 weeks in the frozen palace, devouring everything she could learn from the vast library preserved in its depths, and practicing her magic in the training halls where her ancestors had once honed their skills. The spirits of the Winter Maidens were her constant companions, offering guidance and sharing stories of the old days, and Alara began to understand not just what she could do, but who she was meant to be. She learned about the political structures that had governed Winter Maiden society, councils of equals where decisions were made through consensus rather than the hierarchical pack dynamics she had always known. She studied their philosophy of balance and responsibility, the belief that great power required equally great restraint and wisdom. She read accounts of the betrayal written by survivors, and felt her anger at the wolves solidify into cold determination that such an atrocity would never happen again, that the Winter Maidens would return, but this time they would not be caught unprepared. Comment below if you think Alara should forgive the Winterfang pack, or if they deserve to face the full consequences of their actions, because the moral complexity of this situation is about to get even more intense. During her 4th week in the palace, while Alara was deep in meditation trying to commune with the elemental spirits that governed the highest peaks, she felt a disturbance in the wards that protected the palace grounds. Someone or something had entered the boundary of her territory, and her magic immediately identified them as wolves from Winterfang. Her first instinct was to lash out, to bury the intruders in an avalanche or freeze them solid where they stood, but the discipline she had been learning held her anger in check long enough to investigate before acting. She extended her consciousness through the winter winds and saw a group of about 20 wolves struggling through the deep snow, led by a massive dark-furred alpha that her heart recognized even before her mind caught up. Kyle had come for her, though whether to beg her return or finish what the banishment had started, she could not yet tell. Alara watched from the palace ramparts as the Winterfang wolves made their way slowly up the mountain, clearly suffering from the extreme cold and altitude despite their supernatural resilience. She could have made the journey easier for them with a thought, could have cleared the path and warmed the air, but some vindictive part of her wanted them to struggle the way she had struggled, wanted them to feel a fraction of the suffering they had inflicted on her. The spirits cautioned her against letting vengeance poison her heart, reminding her that the true strength of the Winter Maidens had always been their wisdom and restraint, not just their devastating power. Alara wrestled with herself. The Omega she had been raised to be wanting desperately to ease their suffering, while the furious air of a massacred people wanted to make them pay for every indignity and cruelty. In the end, she compromised. She would let them reach the palace, but she would not help them. And what happened after they arrived would depend entirely on why they had come and what they were prepared to offer. It took the Winterfang party 3 days to reach the palace gates, days during which Alara observed them through her magic and learned much about the state of the pack she had left behind. Kale drove them forward with relentless determination despite the obvious toll the journey was taking. And at night, when they made camp, she could hear him arguing with the beta wolves, who questioned the wisdom of this quest. The pack was falling apart back home, they told him. The plague had spread to the wolves themselves now, hunting. Parties were being attacked by creatures that had never dared enter Winterfang territory before, and several families were talking about leaving to join other packs. The elders blamed Kale for everything, claiming that his leadership was weak and that the pack needed a stronger alpha, someone who would make the hard decisions necessary for survival. But Kale insisted that Alara was the key to saving them all, that his alpha instincts were screaming that she was necessary in ways he could not fully articulate, and that he would not return without her, even if it cost him everything. Listening to him speak about her with such conviction made Alara's heart ache with a complicated mixture of longing and resentment, because where had this passionate defense been when she was standing in that clearing being condemned to death? Where had his certainty been when she was dragged to the boundary stones and thrown beyond pack protection? His words now meant less than nothing compared to his. Silence then, and yet she could not deny the mate bond that pulled at her chest every time she heard his voice, urging her to go to him and accept what her wolf had always known they were meant to be. The Winter Maiden spirits reminded her again that bonds could be rejected, that she owed him nothing simply because the moon goddess had designated them as compatible, and that true partnership had to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and trust, not just supernatural chemistry. If Kale wanted her forgiveness and her love, he would have to earn them through actions, not words, through proving he had genuinely changed and was willing to stand by her regardless of pack opinion. When the Winterfang wolves finally stood before the palace gates, exhausted and frostbitten and staring up at the impossible beauty of the structure with expressions of awe and growing fear, Alara allowed herself to be seen. She stood at the top of the main entrance stairs, dressed in robes of ice that shimmered like diamonds, and with her hair loose around her shoulders, glowing with the same pale blue light that emanated from the palace itself. She had grown into her power over the past month, no longer the thin, frightened girl they had banished, but a figure of terrible beauty and undeniable authority, and she watched with satisfaction as recognition and shock rippled through the group below. Kale shifted back to his human form immediately, not caring that he was naked and vulnerable in front of potential enemies. His dark eyes locked on Alara with an intensity that made her magic flare in response to his focus. He called her name, his voice rough with emotion, and took a step forward, before freezing as the spirits of the Winter Maidens materialized around Alara, like a protective honor guard. The wolves began to panic, their collective fear spiking as they recognized on some instinctive level that they were in the presence of something ancient and powerful and directly connected to the legends their ancestors had tried to erase. Cale held up his hands in a gesture of peace and surrender, his gaze never leaving Alara's face as he told her he knew he had no right to ask anything of her, that he had failed her in the worst possible way when he let the pack banish her without even trying to fight for her. His voice broke as he admitted that he had known she was his fated mate for years, had felt the bond forming between them since she turned 18, but had been too much of a coward to claim her publicly because he feared the pack would reject an alpha who chose such a weak Omega. The honesty of his confession did nothing to diminish Alara's anger. If anything, it made her fury burn colder and sharper because he was confirming that he had knowingly abandoned his mate to save his own reputation and position. She descended the stairs slowly, each step causing frost to spread across the stone and making the wolves back away nervously, until she stood directly in front of Cale, close enough to touch, but separated by a chasm of betrayal that might never be fully bridged. She asked him why she should care about his belated regrets, why she should lift a finger to help the pack that had tried to murder her. What possible reason he could give her to return to people who had made it abundantly clear that they valued her less than dirt. Kyle flinched at each question, but he did not look away or make excuses. And when he finally answered, his words carried the weight of someone who had spent weeks examining his own failures and finding himself wanting. He told her that he could not give her a reason she should help them, that Winterfang did not deserve her compassion or her power, that he personally deserved nothing but her contempt for his weakness and betrayal. But he was not asking for himself, he said. He was asking for the innocent members of the pack, the children who were sick through no fault of their own, the Omegas and lower-ranked wolves who had no voice in pack decisions, but who would suffer and die if things continued as they were. He was asking because even though the pack had wronged her terribly, she was better than they were, kinder and wiser, and more capable of seeing beyond revenge to what was right. It was a clever argument, appealing to the nurturing nature that Omegas were expected to have, while simultaneously acknowledging that she had every right to refuse. And Alara hated that it was working on her even as she recognized the manipulation inherent in the approach. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what Alara decides, because her choice here will determine not just her own fate, but the future of an entire pack, and the legacy of the Winter Maidens themselves. Alara stared at Cale for a long moment, reading the genuine anguish in his expression and the desperate hope he was trying to suppress, and she realized that this was a test not of his character, but of her own. The Winter Maidens had been destroyed in part because they had become isolated, had stopped engaging with the other supernatural communities, and had withdrawn into their mountain fastness until fear and misunderstanding had made them seem like a threat. If she simply turned away from Winterfang and let them collapse, she would be repeating the mistakes of her ancestors, choosing pride and isolation over difficult engagement. But if she helped them, it had to be on her terms, with full accountability for what had been done to her, and genuine structural changes to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. She told Cale that she would return with him to Winterfang, but not to save the pack, but to claim what was rightfully hers. The territory where Winterfang made its home had once been Winter Maiden land, stolen after the massacre, and occupied by wolves who had no legal or moral right to it, and Alara was the last living heir of the true rulers. If the pack wanted her help, they would acknowledge her sovereignty over the territory and accept her as their leader, not as an Omega who existed at their sufferance, but as a queen whose word was law. Every single pack member would submit to her judgment regarding the banishment, would publicly acknowledge their guilt in condemning an innocent, and would accept whatever consequences she deemed appropriate for their actions. The pack structure itself would change, with Omegas gaining real power and protection, with decisions made through council rather than alpha decree, with intolerance for weakness or difference becoming grounds for punishment rather than the weakness itself being punished. The demands were outrageous by wolf standards, asking an alpha to essentially abdicate in favor of someone who was not even fully wolf. asking a pack to completely overturn their social structure and submit to foreign rule. The beta wolves in Kyle's party immediately began to protest, calling Alara's terms impossible and offensive, suggesting that they should take what they needed by force if she would not cooperate willingly. But Kale silenced them with a sharp command, his alpha authority rolling over the group in a wave that made even the most dominant among them lower their eyes in submission. He asked Alara if she truly believed the pack could survive such massive changes, if she had any idea how deeply ingrained the hierarchical structure was in wolf nature, whether she was prepared to enforce her will against potentially hundreds of wolves who would resist her authority. She smiled then, cold and sharp as the ice that formed her palace, and with a casual gesture, caused the temperature to plummet and frost to race across every surface, including the fur and exposed skin of the wolves before her. She told him that she was the Winter Queen, heir to magic that had once kept entire kingdoms in line, and that she was more than capable of enforcing her will against anyone foolish enough to challenge her. But she did not want to rule through fear alone. She wanted to build something better, a society where power was balanced with responsibility, where the strong protected the weak rather than exploiting them, where diversity was valued rather than punished. If Winterfang could not accept that vision, then they would die in the collapse of their own corruption, and she would mourn the innocent while taking satisfaction in the justice delivered to the guilty. The choice was theirs: submit to her terms and live, or cling to their failing traditions and perish. Kale looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, awe and desire and something that might have been fear mixing in his expression, and he dropped to one knee in the snow before her. He offered her his throat in the traditional gesture of ultimate submission, pledging himself as her mate and subject, accepting her as his queen and sovereign in all things. The other wolves followed his lead with varying degrees of reluctance, some moved by their alphas. Example, while others clearly calculating that submission to Alara was better than certain death if they returned home empty-handed. Alara accepted their surrender but did not trust it, knowing that real change would take time and constant vigilance, that there would be wolves who secretly plotted against her and looked for opportunities to return to the old ways. She would need allies within the pack, wolves who genuinely believed in her vision rather than just fearing her power, and she would need to prove herself as a leader who could deliver on her promises of protection and prosperity. The spirits of the Winter Maidens whispered their approval, reminding her that this was how her ancestors had once governed, through a combination of demonstrated power and earned loyalty, creating systems where people followed, not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. The journey back to Winterfang took a week, with Alara using her magic to ease the way and demonstrate her capabilities to the wolves who still harbored doubts about her claim to power. She cleared paths through the snow, created shelters of ice each night that were warmer and more comfortable than anything they could have built on their own, and hunted by calling prey to their camp through her connection to the winter spirits. Each act of magic served a dual purpose, helping the group survive and reinforcing that she was operating on a completely different level than even the strongest alpha. Kale stayed close to her throughout the journey, clearly wanting to talk privately, but respecting her need for space after everything that had happened. She caught him watching her with an expression of mingled wonder and regret, and sometimes she allowed herself to imagine what it might have been like if he had claimed her publicly years ago, if they had built their relationship on honesty and mutual support, rather than secret longing and ultimate betrayal. When they finally crossed back into Winterfang territory, Alara immediately sensed the wrongness that permeated the land, the way the natural magic had become snarled and toxic in her absence. She could feel the sickness spreading through the pack bonds, see the weakness in the wards that should have protected the territory from outside threats, and understood viscerally how close the pack was to complete collapse. It would have been so easy to simply let nature take its course, to watch from a distance as Winterfang destroyed itself through its own failures. But Alara was not the vindictive child they had banished. She had grown into something larger and more complex during her time away, someone who understood that justice was not the same as revenge, and that building something better sometimes meant working with deeply flawed people to achieve necessary change. Share this story with someone who loves tales of outcasts, claiming their power, and transforming the systems that tried to destroy them. Because what comes next is going to showcase the hard work of actual systemic reform. The pack was gathered in the central clearing when Alara and Kale's group emerged from the forest, and the reaction to her appearance was everything she had hoped for and feared. Shock rippled through the crowd as they recognized the Omega they had thrown away, now returning dressed in power like a second skin. Her very presence causing the air to crystallize and snow to fall from a sky that had been clear moments before. Elder. Morvenna's face went white as bone, and several of the wolves who had been most vocal in demanding Alara's banishment actually stumbled backward in fear. But there were others who looked at her with desperate hope, particularly the Omegas and weaker pack members who had always been treated as disposable, and Alara made note of who was who as she walked through the crowd toward the raised platform where the Alpha normally stood to address the pack. Kale followed half a step behind her, his body, language making it clear that he had submitted to her authority, and the murmur of confusion and consternation that spread through the pack would have been amusing if the situation were not so serious. Alara ascended to the platform and looked out over the sea of faces, reading fear, anger, confusion, hope, resentment, and a dozen other emotions in the wolves before her. She began to speak, her voice carrying across the clearing with preternatural clarity as she told them exactly what she was. Showed them visions of the Winter Maiden civilization through her magic so they could not dismiss her claims as delusion. She recounted the massacre their ancestors had participated in, forcing them to confront the genocide that had been conveniently forgotten over the centuries, and she explained how her presence had been protecting them all along in ways they never understood or appreciated. Then she laid out her terms, the same demands she had given Kyle, but expanded with specific details, about how pack governance would change. There would be a council composed of representatives from all pack ranks, with Omegas having equal voice to Alphas in decision-making. Physical strength would no longer be the sole measure of worth, with contributions in healing, teaching, crafting, and other non-combat skills being valued and rewarded appropriately. Any pack member who engaged in bullying, abuse, or discrimination against those they perceived as weaker would face severe consequences, including potential banishment. Most controversially, Alara herself would hold ultimate authority as queen and territory sovereign, with even the Alpha subject to her judgment in all matters. The pack could accept these terms and receive her help in healing the damage they had done, or they could reject them and face extinction as their territory continued to deteriorate without the magical stabilization she provided. The response was immediate and chaotic, with different factions of the pack erupting into arguments about whether Alara's demands were reasonable or outrageous. The more dominant wolves, particularly those who had benefited most from the old hierarchical structure, denounced her terms as an insult to wolf nature and an unacceptable surrender of pack sovereignty. But the Omegas and lower-ranked wolves, those who had suffered under the old system, began to voice support for changes that would finally give them protection and agency. The pack looked like it was on the verge of splitting apart entirely, with wolves literally taking sides and facing off against each other, when Elder Morvenna stepped forward with her hand raised for silence. The old woman looked like she had aged a decade in the weeks since the banishment, her face drawn and haggard, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of its former authority, but rather the weariness of someone who had finally recognized the consequences of her actions. Morvenna admitted publicly that the Council of Elders had been wrong to banish Alara, that they had acted out of fear and prejudice rather than wisdom, and that every ill that had befallen the pack since that day was direct punishment for their injustice. She acknowledged Alara's right to demand accountability and reparations, and while she personally found some of the proposed changes difficult to accept, she recognized that the pack had forfeited its right to negotiate when it condemned an innocent to death. If Alara's price for saving them was the complete restructuring of their society, then perhaps that was what they deserved, a chance to rebuild themselves into something better than what they had been. The admission clearly cost the elder woman everything she had left, and when she finished speaking, she actually knelt before Alara in a gesture of submission that shocked the entire pack into silence. One by one, Other wolves began to kneel as well, some out of genuine remorse, and others out of simple survival instinct, until the entire pack was on their knees before the Omega they had tried to throw away. Ilara felt the weight of their surrender like a physical thing, and she understood that this was the moment where she would either become a true leader or simply another tyrant who ruled through fear. She told them to rise, that she did not want their submission born of terror, but their cooperation, born of recognition that change was necessary. She began the work of healing the territory immediately, walking the boundaries and repairing the magical wards that had fractured, cleansing the sickness from the land and the pack bonds with applications of her winter maiden power that left her exhausted, but grimly satisfied. It took weeks of constant effort, with Ilara working herself to the point of collapse each day, while also beginning the difficult process of restructuring pack governance and addressing individual cases of abuse and injustice that had flourished under the old system. Kyle supported her throughout, using his alpha authority to enforce her decrees and standing publicly by her side, even when it cost him the respect of wolves who thought he should be challenging her rather than enabling her. He was trying so hard to prove himself, to demonstrate that he had learned from his failure and would not make the same mistake again. And Ilara could feel her resistance to him slowly eroding, despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. The mate bond pulled at both of them, constantly, made worse by proximity and his obvious devotion. And there were nights when she almost gave in to the desire to accept what they could have together, but the spirits of her ancestors counseled patience, reminding her that forgiveness too quickly given taught nothing, and that Kale needed to prove his commitment through sustained action over time, not just weeks of good behavior while the crisis was fresh. If you've made it this far into the story, leave a comment about whether you think Ilara is being too harsh with Kale, or if she's right to make him work for her forgiveness, because the complexity of their relationship is central to everything that follows. The real test came 3 months after Ilara's return, when a delegation from the neighboring Silvercrest pack arrived demanding to know why Winterfang was allowing itself to be ruled by an outsider and suggesting that such weakness might warrant territorial conquest. The Silvercrest Alpha was a brutal man named Ragnar, who had been looking for an excuse to absorb Winterfang's lands for years, and he clearly saw Ilara's presence as the perfect opportunity to challenge Winterfang's sovereignty. He demanded a formal challenge for pack leadership, alpha against alpha in traditional combat, and when Ilara pointed out that she was not an alpha by wolf standards, Ragnar claimed that proved his point, that she had no legitimate authority over wolf territory. Kyle immediately stepped forward to fight in Ilara's defense, but she stopped him with a gesture and informed Ragnar that she would accept his challenge personally. The Silvercrest wolves laughed at the idea of their massive alpha fighting a slight woman in single combat, clearly expecting an easy victory, and Ragnar himself seemed almost offended at the implication that she thought she could match him. But Ilara had not spent 3 months learning to use her power in careful, measured ways. She had also been training with the spirits and combat applications of Winter Maiden magic, and she was more than ready to demonstrate why her ancestors had been so feared. The challenge was set for the following day in neutral territory, with both packs gathering to witness what everyone assumed would be a quick and brutal lesson about why wolves did not let outsiders rule them. When Ragnar attacked in his massive wolf form, all teeth and claws and several 100 pounds of supernatural predator, Ilara did not flinch. She simply extended her hand, and the moisture in the air around Ragnar crystallized instantly, forming a cage of ice so dense and cold that it burned his fur where it made contact. He slammed against the barriers with enough force to shatter stone, but the ice held firm, and Ilara calmly explained to the watching crowd that she was not some weak Omega they could dismiss. She was the Winter Queen, and her power was beyond anything their limited understanding could comprehend. She could have killed Ragnar easily, could have frozen him solid and shattered him like glass. But instead, she offered him mercy on the condition that he and his pack swear to respect Winterfang's sovereignty and Ilara's rule over her own territory. The alternative, she made clear, was that she would expand her domain to include Silvercrest and every other pack in the region, bringing them all under Winter Maiden authority, whether they liked it or not. Ragnar, trapped and humiliated but not stupid, accepted her terms, and word of the challenge spread quickly through the supernatural community. Other packs that might have seen Winterfang as vulnerable now understood that Alara was not just powerful, but willing to use that power to protect what was hers, and the challenges stopped coming. Within Winterfang itself, the demonstration of Alara's capabilities finally silenced most of the remaining dissent, though there were still wolves who resented her rule and looked for ways to undermine her authority without directly challenging her. She dealt with each case individually, sometimes with punishment, but more often with attempts at education and rehabilitation, trying to build a culture where people followed the new rules because they understood why they existed, rather than just because they feared consequences. The pack slowly transformed under her guidance, with former outcasts rising to positions of influence based on their actual skills rather than their rank, and with the overall health and prosperity of the territory improving as Alara's magic continued to stabilize and strengthen the land. Children who had been sick recovered fully, hunting parties returned with abundant game, and the pack bonds reformed stronger than they had been in generations. It was everything Alara had promised and more. Proof that her way of governing was not just idealistic philosophy, but practical policy that delivered real results. And through it all, Kale remained at her side, learning to lead in a new way that emphasized collaboration over domination, earning the trust and respect of pack members, who had initially resented the changes, but who could not argue with the improved conditions of their lives. On the 6-month anniversary of Alara's return, Kale asked to speak with her privately, and she finally agreed to the conversation they had been dancing around since the beginning. They walked through the winter forest together, surrounded by snow that sparkled in the moonlight, and responded to Alara's presence by forming beautiful patterns in the air around them. Kyle told her that he understood if she could never forgive him for his betrayal, that he knew he had failed her in the worst possible way, and that no amount of subsequent good behavior could erase that fundamental breach of trust. But he wanted her to know that loving her and serving her had taught him more about what it meant to be an alpha than all his years of traditional training combined. That she had transformed not just the pack, but him, personally into someone better than he had been, and that even if she never accepted him as her mate, he would spend the rest of his life grateful for the opportunity to be part of what she was building. The honesty and humility in his words touched something in Alara that she had been trying to protect. The part of her that still loved him despite everything, that recognized the genuine transformation he had undergone and the consistent way he had supported her even when it cost him personally. She told him that forgiveness was not something that happened all at once, but rather a choice made daily over time, and that while she was not ready to fully trust him with her heart again, she was willing to begin exploring what a real relationship between them might look like if they built it consciously, rather than just accepting the mate bond as inevitable. It was not the passionate declaration he might have hoped for, but it was a door opening where before there had been only a wall, and Kale accepted it with the same quiet determination he had shown in everything else since her return. Before we move into the final section of this story, hit that subscribe button if you appreciate stories that show real growth and accountability rather than quick fixes and easy forgiveness. Over the next year, Alara and Kale slowly built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and the conscious choice to work through their complicated history rather than simply letting the mate bond paper over the cracks. They argued sometimes, usually about how to handle pack members who resisted change, but they learned to communicate honestly and to see each other's perspectives even when they disagreed. Alara introduced Kyle to the spirits of the Winter Maidens, and he learned about the civilization that had been destroyed, coming to understand the weight of historical trauma that Alara carried and the responsibility she felt to ensure her ancestors' legacy was honored. Kale, in turn, helped Alara understand wolf pack dynamics from the inside, explaining nuances of pack politics and social structures that helped her govern more effectively. The pack continued to thrive under their joint leadership, becoming known throughout the region as an example of how supernatural communities could evolve beyond traditional hierarchies into something more equitable and sustainable. Other packs began sending observers to learn from Winterfang's model, and some even implemented similar reforms in their own territories. Ilara established a school for young winter maidens, reaching out to other packs to identify girls and women who carried the bloodline and inviting them to learn about their heritage and develop their powers. The Frozen Palace became not just her personal sanctuary, but a center of learning and culture, with the spirits of her ancestors delighting in seeing their knowledge passed on to a new generation. 2 years after her return to Winterfang, Ilara finally felt ready to fully accept Kale as her mate, not because the bond demanded it, but because he had proven through consistent action over time that he was worthy of her trust and love. They held a ceremony that blended wolf traditions with Winter Maiden customs, creating something new that honored both aspects of who they were, and the pack celebrated with genuine joy rather than the resentful obligation that might have characterized such an event in the old days. The mating bond, when finally consummated by choice rather than just biological destiny, was more powerful than either of them had imagined, creating a connection that allowed them to share thoughts and feelings in ways that made their partnership even stronger. But Ilara never forgot where she had come from, or what she had endured, and she made sure that every Omega in Winterfang, and eventually in allied packs, knew that they had value and power, regardless of what others might think of them. She told her story openly, not to inspire pity, but to demonstrate that perceived weakness could be hidden strength, that being underestimated could be an advantage, and that the most important thing was to never accept others' limited vision of what you could become. The weak Omega who had been thrown into the snow to die had become the Winter Queen who transformed an entire supernatural society, and that transformation was possible because she had refused to let cruelty and rejection define her worth. The pack that had banished her learned to kneel not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for what she had built and the better world she had created for all of them. And if sometimes in the deep winter, when the snow fell heavy and cold, the wolves of Winterfang told their children stories about the Omega who commanded the storm and saved them all from their own worst natures, well, that was exactly the kind of legend Ilara wanted to leave behind. Not a story of revenge, but of transformation. Not a tale of power wielded cruelly, but of justice served with wisdom. Not a tragedy of a victim, but a triumph of a survivor who became something greater than anyone had imagined possible. The Winter Maidens had returned, but this time they would not fall, because they had learned from history and built something strong enough to weather any storm that might come.